The overhead lights of the aircraft cabin cast a soft glow as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, searching for their seats. Flight 447 was scheduled to depart in 30 minutes, and the usual pre-flight chaos filled the air. People struggled with oversized carry-ons, checked their boarding passes twice, and settled into their spots with relieved sighs. In seat 2A, right up front in first class, a man in his mid-30s adjusted his seatbelt and pulled out a tablet from his leather bag. His navy blue suit was slightly wrinkled from a long day, and exhaustion was written across his face. He'd been away from home for nearly a week, stuck in endless training sessions and simulator runs. All he wanted now was to close his eyes during this 2-hour flight and finally get home to his family. His name was David Chen, and he'd been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years. Tomorrow morning, he had one of the biggest evaluations of his career. If everything went well, he'd become a training captain, responsible for teaching the next generation of pilots. But right now, his mind was too tired to worry about tomorrow. He just wanted to review a few protocol notes and then rest. As David scrolled through his tablet, he barely noticed the flight attendant moving through the cabin, checking overhead bins and greeting passengers. The familiar sounds of travel surrounded him. A baby cried somewhere in the back. A businessman 2 rows behind him was already on a conference call, talking loudly about quarterly projections. A woman across the aisle fumbled with her phone, trying to switch it to airplane mode. Then, a voice cut through the ambient noise. Sharp, direct, impossible to ignore. "Excuse me, sir. Sir." David looked up. A flight attendant stood in the aisle, hands on her hips, staring directly at him. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression was anything but friendly. The name tag on her uniform read Christine. "Yes?" David said, setting down his tablet. "Can I help you with something?" "I need to see your boarding pass." Her tone wasn't a request. It was a demand. David blinked, slightly confused. "Is there a problem?" "This is the first-class section," Christine said, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "I need to verify you're in the right seat." A weird feeling settled in David's stomach. He'd flown hundreds of times in uniform and out of it. He'd sat in first class countless times when the airline gave crew members upgrade vouchers or when he was traveling for work observations. Never once had a flight attendant demanded to see his boarding pass after he was already seated. But he reached into his jacket pocket anyway, pulling out the crumpled paper. "Here you go." Christine snatched it from his hand and examined it with exaggerated care, tilting it toward the light as if searching for some kind of forgery. Her eyes narrowed. She looked at the boarding pass, then at David, then back at the pass again. Around them, other passengers started to notice. The businessman ended his phone call. The woman across the aisle looked up from her phone. An older couple in the row behind leaned forward slightly, curious about the commotion. "Seat 2A, Christine read aloud, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Are you absolutely sure you didn't make a mistake? The economy section is toward the back of the plane." She gestured behind her with a sweep of her arm. David felt heat rise in his chest. The implication was crystal clear. She didn't think he belonged here. "My boarding pass says 2A, David replied, keeping his voice steady. "There's no mistake." Christine's face flushed pink. "Sir, these first-class seats cost thousands of dollars. We have problems all the time with passengers who sit in the wrong section, hoping no one will notice. So I'm going to need to verify this with the gate agent." "Verify what exactly?" David asked. His patience was wearing thin, but he knew from experience that losing his temper would only make things worse. "My name is on that boarding pass. My seat number is on that boarding pass. Everything matches." "Company policy requires me to confirm," Christine insisted, though David had never heard of any such policy. "Please collect your belongings and step into the jetway while I sort this out. You're holding up the boarding process." Several passengers were now openly staring. Some looked uncomfortable, averting their eyes. Others seemed curious, waiting to see what would happen next. A few had their phones out, though they weren't recording. Not yet anyway. David stayed seated. "I'm not going anywhere. My seat assignment is correct and I have every right to be here." Christine's expression hardened. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, I have no choice but to call security. Your entitlement is delaying this entire flight." That word. Entitlement. It hung in the air like an accusation, and David knew exactly what it meant. He'd heard variations of it before. Too many times. The subtle suggestions that he was somehow getting something he didn't deserve. The shocked reactions when he walked into the cockpit. The passengers who'd requested to speak to the actual pilot after hearing his voice over the intercom. He took a deep breath. Around him, the cabin had gone almost silent. Even the baby in the back had stopped crying. Everyone in first class was watching now, waiting to see how this scene would play out. David made a decision. "Before you call security," he said quietly, reaching into his inner jacket pocket, "maybe you should take a look at this." He pulled out a black leather wallet and flipped it open. Inside was a laminated card with his photo, official airline insignia, and several lines of text. His commercial pilot's license. Right there in bold letters, Captain David Chen. Christine's eyes went wide. The color drained from her face so fast that David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She stared at the license, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to process what she was seeing. The confident accusatory tone from moments ago had completely vanished. "Captain Chen," David said, his voice calm but firm, "I've been flying for this airline for 15 years. I'm actually scheduled to pilot this exact route next month. I'm doing a passenger observation today, but right now I'm just trying to get home to my wife and daughters just like everyone else on this plane." The silence in the cabin was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Every single person in first class was frozen, watching the scene unfold. Christine's professional composure shattered. "Captain, I apologize. I didn't know. I didn't realize you didn't realize I was a pilot," David interrupted. "But here's what bothers me, Christine. You saw me sitting here and immediately assumed I didn't belong. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to prove they had the right seat. Just me. You saw me and decided I must have made a mistake, or maybe I was trying to sneak into a seat I couldn't afford." Christine took a step backward, her face now bright red. "Sir Captain, I was just doing my job. We deal with seating issues all the time. I didn't mean what?" David asked. The question wasn't angry. It was tired, disappointed. "Do you ask every first-class passenger to show their boarding pass? Or just the ones who don't look like they belong here?" She didn't answer. They both knew she couldn't. Another flight attendant, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, appeared from the front galley. His name tag said Robert. He'd clearly heard everything, and his expression was a mix of concern and embarrassment. "Captain Chen," Robert said, his voice respectful. "It's an honor to have you on board, sir. Christine, I'll take over here. Why don't you help Mike with the rear cabin preparations?" Christine nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She practically fled toward the back of the plane, her shoulders hunched with shame. Robert leaned down slightly. "Captain, I'm truly sorry for what just happened. That was completely unacceptable, and it doesn't represent who we are as a crew." David nodded, acknowledging the apology, but the anger and hurt still burned inside him. He'd handled the situation with grace, but that didn't make it okay. That didn't erase the humiliation of being singled out in front of dozens of people. That didn't change the fact that this kept happening over and over in different ways. As the plane prepared for departure, David stared out the window at the tarmac below. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He thought about his two daughters at home, about how they were already noticing that their father was sometimes treated differently, about how he'd have to find the right words to explain why, once again, someone had assumed he didn't belong somewhere he had every right to be. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife. "Have a safe flight, honey. The girls can't wait to see you. Love you." David closed his eyes and took another deep breath. Tomorrow's evaluation suddenly felt like the least of his concerns. The airplane engines hummed steadily as Flight 447 leveled off at cruising altitude. Most passengers had settled into their routines. Some scrolled through phones in airplane mode. Others pulled out books or closed their eyes for a nap. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with drink carts offering beverages with practiced smiles. But in seat 2A, David couldn't settle down. His heart was still racing from the confrontation 20 minutes earlier. He stared out the window at the clouds below, but his mind kept replaying the scene. Christine's accusatory tone. The other passengers staring. The assumption written all over her face that he didn't belong there. He'd been through versions of this before, but never quite so public. Never so blatant. His phone sat in his lap, still showing his wife's text message. He thought about calling her when they landed, telling her what happened. But what would he even say? That once again, someone had looked at him and seen a problem instead of a person, that his credentials, his years of experience, his spotless record meant nothing compared to someone's snap judgment. Across the aisle, an elderly man cleared his throat softly. David glanced over. The man was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and a kind face lined with age. He wore a simple gray cardigan and glasses that sat low on his nose. "Excuse me, Captain," the man said quietly, leaning slightly toward David. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier. I just wanted to say that was handled with remarkable grace on your part." David managed a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a retired Air Force colonel," the man continued. "Flew for 30 years, and I've seen too many incidents like that one. It never gets easier to watch, and I imagine it's even harder to experience. Thank you for your service, both in the air and just now, showing that young woman the dignity she didn't show you." The words landed softly but meaningfully. David nodded, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "That means a lot, sir. Thank you." A few rows back, a teenage boy had witnessed the entire exchange. He was maybe 16 or 17, wearing a hoodie and headphones around his neck. When David glanced back, their eyes met for a brief moment. The kid gave him a subtle thumbs up, his expression serious and knowing. In that small gesture, David understood something important. That teenager had seen someone who looked like him stand his ground with dignity. He'd seen that you could face disrespect and still maintain composure, that you could be right and still be questioned, but you didn't have to accept it silently. David gave a small nod back. Sometimes the reason to speak up wasn't just for yourself. It was for everyone watching who needed to see that they belonged in spaces where others might question their presence. Meanwhile, in the rear galley of the plane, Christine sat on the jump seat with her head in her hands. Robert stood nearby along with Mike, the third flight attendant. The atmosphere was heavy with uncomfortable silence. "What were you thinking?" Robert finally asked. His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, disappointed. Christine looked up, her eyes red. "I don't know. I just saw him sitting there and I thought..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought what?" Mike pressed. "That a black man in first class must be in the wrong seat?" "I didn't think of it like that," Christine said weakly. We do have people sit in the wrong section sometimes, and I thought I was being thorough." "Christine," Robert said, sitting down across from her, "I've worked this route for 12 years. I've never once seen you ask a white passenger in first class to prove they belonged there." Not once, the words hung in the air. Christine's face crumpled. "I made a terrible mistake. I know that. I embarrassed him in front of everyone. I embarrassed the airline. I embarrassed myself." "You did more than that," Robert said quietly. "You made that man feel like he didn't belong somewhere he absolutely had the right to be. David Chen is one of the best pilots in this company. He's been flying for 15 years. He's up for a promotion to training captain, and even if he were just a regular passenger who paid for that seat, he deserved basic respect and the benefit of the doubt." Christine wiped her eyes. "What's going to happen to me?" "I've already filed an incident report," Robert said. "The captain of this flight is aware of what happened. This is going to go to human resources, and there will be consequences. But more importantly, you need to think about why this happened." "Why you made that assumption?" "Because this isn't just about following procedure. This is about something deeper." Up in the cockpit, Captain Linda Martinez had indeed heard about the incident. During a quiet moment in the flight, she'd gotten the full story from Robert over the intercom. Now she sat in the pilot's seat, shaking her head. "David Chen," she said to her co-pilot Tom. "Of all the people to pull that with." "You know him?" Tom asked. "Everyone knows David. He's brilliant, patient. One of the best instructors we have, even before the official promotion. He's exactly the kind of person we need more of in aviation." She paused. "And he's exactly the kind of person who shouldn't have to deal with this nonsense in 2024. Back in the cabin, David had pulled out his tablet again, trying to focus on the flight protocols he needed to review. But the words blurred together on the screen. His mind kept wandering. He thought about his daughters, 7-year-old Lily and 9-year-old Sophie. They were smart, curious kids who loved asking questions about everything. Lately, those questions had gotten harder to answer. "Daddy, why did that lady at the restaurant ask if you were sure you could pay before giving us the check?" Daddy, why did that man at the airport seem surprised when you said you were the pilot? Daddy, why does everyone always seem shocked when they meet you? His wife, Rachel, tried to help him explain. They'd had long conversations about how to talk to their daughters about bias, about assumptions, about the reality that people might treat them differently because of how they looked. But how do you prepare your children for a world that might not always see their worth? How do you protect them from the 1,000 small cuts of being questioned, doubted, and made to feel like outsiders in spaces where they absolutely belonged? David's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen. It was his supervisor, Captain James Wilson, the airline's chief pilot. David's stomach tightened. Word traveled fast, he answered quietly. Hello? David, it's James. I just got a report about what happened on your flight today. Are you okay? David glanced around, making sure he wouldn't disturb other passengers. I'm fine. Just tired. I want you to know that HR and I will be looking into this immediately. What happened was completely unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values of this airline. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I appreciate that, sir, David said. But I need to know this is going to lead to real change, not just disciplinary action for one person. Christine isn't the real problem. The problem is the system that never taught her to question her assumptions. There was a pause on the other end. You're absolutely right. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that's going to make you an outstanding training captain. Your evaluation is still scheduled for tomorrow at 8 a.m., and I have complete confidence in you. Thank you, sir. David, one more thing. The way you handled yourself today? That's leadership. That's what we need more of. I'll see you tomorrow. The call ended, and David sat back in his seat. Through the window, the clouds had broken up, revealing patches of land far below. Towns and cities connected by ribbons of highway. Lives being lived by people who had no idea what was happening in this plane, in this moment. Robert appeared in the aisle with a bottle of water. Captain Chen, I wanted to check on you. Can I get you anything? I'm okay, Robert. Thank you. Robert lowered his voice. I know my apology doesn't fix what happened, but I want you to know I've made sure this gets documented properly. This can't keep happening. David looked up at the older flight attendant and saw genuine concern in his eyes. I appreciate you speaking up, Robert. That matters. As Robert moved away, David finally opened his notes app and began typing. Not flight protocols, not evaluation prep. Instead, he wrote down everything he was feeling. The anger, the hurt, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove himself, but also the responsibility he felt to use moments like this to create change. Because staying silent was easier. Not making waves was safer. But silence had never fixed anything. And if he didn't speak up, if he didn't use his position and his voice to push for something better, then who would? Tomorrow he had an evaluation that could determine the next phase of his career. But today had reminded him that his career was about more than just flying planes. It was about opening doors for the people coming after him. It was about making sure the next generation wouldn't have to face the same doubts and assumptions he'd faced. The plane began its descent. Through the window, David could see the city lights starting to sparkle in the early evening. Home was close now. His family was waiting. And tomorrow, he would walk into that evaluation room not as someone who'd been diminished, but as someone who'd been reminded exactly why representation mattered. The wheels touched down smoothly on the runway. As passengers gathered their belongings, David remained seated for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Whatever consequences came from today's incident, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this moment be forgotten. He was going to make sure it meant something. David's key turned in the front door lock just after 8 in the evening. The familiar sound brought immediate chaos from inside the house. Tiny footsteps thundered down the hallway, and before he could even set down his bag, 2 small bodies crashed into him. Daddy's home. 7-year-old Lily squealed, wrapping her arms around his waist. Sophie, his 9-year-old, was right behind her sister. We missed you so much. Mom said you'd be home for dinner, but you're late. David dropped to one knee, pulling both girls into a tight hug. He breathed in the scent of their strawberry shampoo and felt some of the day's tension finally begin to melt away. I'm sorry I'm late, sweethearts. My flight got delayed a bit, but I'm here now. Rachel appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile was warm, but David could see the question in her eyes. She knew him well enough to recognize when something was wrong, even when he was trying to hide it. Girls, why don't you go wash up for dinner? Rachel said. Daddy needs to put his things away. The girls reluctantly released their father and ran toward the bathroom, already arguing about who would use the sink first. David stood up slowly, suddenly feeling every bit of his exhaustion. Rachel walked over and kissed him gently. "Rough day?" "You could say that," David murmured. "Want to talk about it?" He glanced toward the bathroom where his daughters were still bickering. "After they go to bed?" Rachel nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Dinner's ready whenever you are." The meal was simple but perfect. Spaghetti with meatballs, garlic bread, and a salad. Lily told an animated story about her art class, complete with dramatic hand gestures that nearly knocked over her water glass twice. Sophie talked about the book she was reading, a mystery about kids who solved crimes in their neighborhood. David listened and smiled and asked questions, grateful for the normalcy of it all. This was real. This was what mattered. His daughters laughing, his wife's hand occasionally touching his arm. The warmth of home after a long week away. But underneath it all, his mind kept drifting back to the plane, to Christine's face, to the stares of other passengers, to the weight of constantly having to prove he belonged in spaces where others were simply accepted. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the girls had brushed their teeth and changed into pajamas, David sat on the edge of Sophie's bed for their nightly routine. She snuggled under her covers, her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "Daddy, will you tell me a flying story?" Sophie asked, her eyes already heavy with sleep. David smiled. "What kind of story?" "A real one. About something that happened when you were flying." He thought for a moment, then began telling her about a flight last year, when he'd successfully navigated around a massive storm system, finding a smooth path through rough weather. He made it exciting but not scary, emphasizing the training and teamwork that made flying safe. "You're the best pilot in the whole world," Sophie said sleepily. David's throat tightened. "Thank you, sweetie. That means everything to me." "Daddy?" Sophie's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "Why do some people seem surprised when you tell them you're a pilot?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. He'd been dreading this conversation, hoping it could wait a few more years. But children noticed more than adults gave them credit for. "Well," David said carefully, "sometimes people have ideas in their heads about what certain jobs should look like, and when they meet someone who doesn't match that picture, it surprises them." "But that's silly," Sophie said, frowning. "Anyone can be a pilot if they work hard and learn, right?" "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Anyone can. But sometimes it takes people a while to understand that." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing. "I think you're going to teach them. Because you're really good at teaching people things." David leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I love you, Sophie. Sweet dreams." "Love you too, Daddy." He turned off her light and stepped into the hallway where Rachel was waiting. She'd been listening from outside the door. Without a word, she took his hand and led him downstairs to the living room. They sat together on the couch, and David finally let the weight of the day settle over him. He told Rachel everything. The confrontation with Christine, the public humiliation, the way other passengers had stared, the phone call from his supervisor. Rachel listened without interrupting, her hand never leaving his. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she finally said. "You deserve so much better than that." "The thing is," David said, staring at his hands, "I keep thinking about Sophie's question just now. She's 9 years old and she's already noticing. She's already seeing that people treat me differently, and she's starting to wonder why. How long before it starts happening to her?" "To Lily?" Rachel's eyes glistened with tears. "I know, I think about that all the time. When I showed Christine my pilot's license today, part of me felt vindicated, like I'd proven her wrong. But another part of me was just tired. Tired of having to prove anything. Tired of knowing that my daughters are going to face the same doubts and questions. Tired of living in a world where your credentials matter less than someone's assumptions about you." "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked softly. David was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow's my evaluation. If I pass, I become a training captain. That means I'll be shaping the next generation of pilots. I'll have a real voice in how this airline operates, how we train people, what values we emphasize. And I think I need to use that voice. Not just for me, but for everyone who comes after me. Today was humiliating, yes, but it was also a reminder that representation matters, that visibility matters, that speaking up matters." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You know I support you, whatever you decide. But I also know that speaking up can be risky, It can make you a target. It can affect your career. I know, David said. But staying silent hasn't fixed anything. If I don't speak up, if I don't use whatever privilege and platform I have to push for change, then what's the point? What kind of world am I leaving for Sophie and Lily? They sat in silence for a while, just holding hands in the dim light of the living room. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Inside, their daughters slept peacefully upstairs, unaware of the difficult conversations happening below. Rachel finally spoke. Remember when you first told me you wanted to be a pilot? We were in college, and you'd just taken your first introductory flight. You came back so excited, talking about how being up there made everything feel possible. David smiled at the memory. I remember. You thought I was crazy for wanting to take on all that training and debt? I did, Rachel admitted. But then I saw how determined you were. How you worked 2 jobs to pay for flight school. How you studied until 2 in the morning for every exam. How you never let anyone tell you it was too hard or too expensive or that you didn't fit the mold. You believed you belonged up there and you made it happen. It wasn't easy, David said quietly. No, it wasn't. But you did it anyway. And now you're not just a pilot. You're one of the best. You're about to become a training captain. You have a voice, David, a real voice. And I think you're right. I think you need to use it. David looked at his wife, grateful for her support, grateful for her understanding. What if it backfires? What if I make things harder for myself? Then we'll deal with it together, Rachel said firmly. But I'd rather you speak up and face consequences than stay silent and live with regret. Our daughters need to see that standing up for what's right matters more than playing it safe. David nodded slowly. She was right. He knew she was right. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text message from an unknown number. He picked it up and read, Captain Chen, this is Kevin. I was the teenager sitting a few rows behind you on Flight 447 today. I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled that situation. I've been thinking about becoming a pilot, but I wasn't sure if someone like me belonged in that world. Watching you today showed me that we do belong. Thank you for not backing down. David stared at the message, his vision blurring with tears. He showed it to Rachel, who read it and smiled through her own tears. See, she said softly. You're already making a difference. David set down his phone and pulled his wife close. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The evaluation. Conversations with HR about what happened on the flight. Decisions about how far to push for change. But tonight he had this. His family. His purpose. And a growing conviction that some battles were worth fighting. Not despite the cost, but because the cost of silence was even higher. He thought about young Kevin, somewhere out there, maybe lying in bed thinking about his own future in aviation. He thought about his daughters upstairs dreaming their own dreams. He thought about every person who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong somewhere they absolutely had the right to be. Tomorrow, he would step into that evaluation room. And whatever happened after that, he would step into it as someone committed to being part of the solution. Not just a pilot, but a voice for change. The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning. David reached over and silenced it before it could wake Rachel. She stirred slightly but didn't open her eyes. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, gathering himself for the day ahead. Today was the evaluation, the one he'd been preparing for all year, the one that would determine if he became a training captain. Under normal circumstances, he'd be nervous but excited. Today, he just felt tired. He showered, shaved, and put on his uniform with careful precision. The dark navy jacket, the crisp white shirt, the tie with the airline's colors. He'd worn this uniform thousands of times, but today it felt different. Heavier somehow, like armor. Rachel appeared in the doorway as he was adjusting his tie. She was still in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. You didn't have to get up, David said softly. Yes, I did, she replied, walking over to fix his collar. Big day, he echoed. She looked up at him, her hands resting on his chest. You're going to do great. You're the best pilot they have, and they know it. Thanks, David said, but his mind was already drifting to yesterday's incident. Would it affect his evaluation? Would people look at him differently now? Would he be seen as a troublemaker for not just letting it go? Rachel seemed to read his thoughts. David, listen to me. What happened yesterday doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished. You walk into that room with your head held high, understand? He nodded, kissed her forehead, and grabbed his bag. The drive to the airport was quiet. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The roads were nearly empty. Just him and a few other early risers heading to their own destinations. David arrived at the training facility at 7:15. The building was modern, all glass and steel, with simulators and classrooms where pilots came to maintain their certifications and learn new skills. He'd been here hundreds of times, but today the familiar space felt foreign. In the lobby, he ran into Patricia, another senior captain he'd known for years. She was one of the few other pilots of color at the airline, and they'd developed a quiet friendship over the years, bonding over shared experiences they didn't always talk about openly. "Hey, David," Patricia said, her expression knowing. "I heard about what happened yesterday." David's stomach dropped. Of course she'd heard. Word traveled fast in the aviation community. "News travels, huh?" he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Always does." Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, I know today's your evaluation. Don't let yesterday get in your head. You've earned this promotion 10 times over. What that flight attendant did, that's on her, not you." "Thanks, Patricia. I appreciate that." "I mean it," she said firmly. "We need more people like you in leadership positions. People who've lived it, who understand what it's like to constantly prove yourself. So you go in there and show them exactly why you're the right person for this job." Her words steadied him. He nodded, squared his shoulders, and headed toward the evaluation room. Captain James Wilson was already there, along with 2 other senior evaluators. The room contained a full flight simulator, computer stations, and various technical equipment. This wasn't just a simple test. It would be hours of intensive scenarios, decision-making under pressure, and demonstration of teaching ability. "David," James said, shaking his hand. "Good to see you. Ready to get started?" "Ready as I'll ever be, sir." The evaluation began. For the next 4 hours, David was put through every scenario imaginable. Engine failures at critical moments, severe weather conditions, medical emergencies, system malfunctions. Each time he had to not only solve the problem but explain his thought process clearly, demonstrating how he would teach another pilot to handle the same situation. He focused completely, blocking out everything else. Yesterday's incident faded into the background. His exhaustion disappeared. This was what he'd trained for. This was what he was good at. Up here in the simulator, his skills spoke for themselves. No one could question whether he belonged. During a brief break around noon, David stepped outside to call Rachel. "How's it going?" she asked immediately. "Good, I think. They're not giving me any hints, but I feel solid about what I've done so far." "That's my guy," Rachel said warmly. "The girls want to make you a celebration dinner tonight. Lily's already planning the menu." David smiled. "Tell them I can't wait." After the call, he stood in the hallway for a moment, gathering himself for the second half. That's when he saw Christine. She was walking down the corridor with another flight attendant, probably heading to their own training session. When she spotted David, she froze. The color drained from her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. The other flight attendant looked confused, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Christine said something to her colleague, who continued walking. Then she approached David slowly, like someone approaching a fire they weren't sure was still burning. "Captain Chen," she said quietly, "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to say something." David waited, saying nothing. Christine took a shaky breath. "I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about what I did. I talked to HR this morning. I'm being suspended for 2 weeks and I have to complete bias training before I can return to work. But none of that matters compared to what I need to say to you." She looked directly at him now, her eyes red-rimmed. "I was wrong. Not just wrong about you being in that seat, but wrong in how I saw you. I made an assumption based on nothing but what you looked like, and I treated you with disrespect you absolutely didn't deserve. I humiliated you in front of dozens of people, and no apology can take that back." David remained silent, letting her continue. "I've been a flight attendant for 8 years, Christine went on. "And I realized last night that this wasn't the first time I've made assumptions like that. It was just the first time I got called out for it. I've been walking around with blinders on, never questioning my own biases. I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of who I was yesterday." "Who you were yesterday," David finally spoke. "Or who you still are?" Christine flinched at the question. "I want to be better. I need to be better. I've started working with a counselor to understand my own prejudices. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm trying to learn. David studied her face. He could see genuine remorse there, genuine shame. But he also knew that one moment of accountability didn't erase a lifetime of learned bias. Christine, he said slowly, I appreciate you saying this. I do, but here's the thing. You're apologizing to me because I turned out to be a pilot, because I had credentials that made you realize you were wrong. But what about all the people who don't have that? What about the passengers who sit in first class and get questioned, but they can't pull out a pilot's license to prove they belong? Do they deserve respect too, or only the people who can prove their worth to you? Christine's face crumbled. You're right. God, you're right. I never thought about it that way. That's the problem, David said, not unkindly. Most people don't think about it. They make snap judgments, treat people based on assumptions, and never question why. The real work isn't just apologizing when you get caught. It's examining why you made that assumption in the first place. I know, Christine whispered. I'm trying to do that work now. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make sure I never do it again. David nodded slowly. Then I hope you mean that. Because the airline needs flight attendants who treat every passenger with dignity, regardless of what they look like or where they're sitting. If you can become that person, then maybe something good can come from this. Thank you, Christine said, for giving me grace I didn't deserve. I'm not doing it for you, David said honestly. I'm doing it because I have 2 daughters at home who are going to face assumptions about them their entire lives. And I need to believe that people can learn and grow and do better. Otherwise, what kind of world are they growing up in? Christine nodded, tears streaming down her face now. I won't let you down. I promise. She walked away and David stood there for a moment processing the conversation. He didn't know if Christine would really change. He didn't know if one incident would truly make her examine her biases. But he'd given her the truth, and what she did with it was up to her. James appeared in the doorway. David, we're ready for the second half. David straightened his uniform and walked back into the evaluation room. The next 2 hours were even more challenging than the first. Complex scenarios that required split-second decisions. Teaching simulations where he had to guide a struggling student through a difficult landing. Emergency protocols that tested his knowledge and leadership. Through it all, David remained focused and calm. He explained his reasoning clearly. He demonstrated patience and expertise. He showed exactly why he deserved this promotion. Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, it was over. The 3 evaluators huddled together, reviewing notes and comparing scores. David stood off to the side, trying not to let his exhaustion show. His feet ached. His head throbbed. But he'd given everything he had. James finally approached, his expression unreadable. Captain Chen, he said formally. Then he broke into a smile and extended his hand. Congratulations. Welcome to the training captain program. That was one of the strongest evaluations I've ever witnessed. Relief flooded through David so powerfully he almost staggered. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. You earned it, James said. Every bit of it. Now go home to your family. We'll discuss your new responsibilities next week. David walked out of the building into the late afternoon sunlight. He pulled out his phone and called Rachel. I passed, he said when she answered. I'm a training captain. Rachel's scream of joy was so loud he had to pull the phone away from his ear. In the background, he could hear his daughters cheering. As he drove home, David felt something shift inside him. The evaluation was done. He'd proven himself once again. But more importantly, he'd stood at a crossroads and made a choice. He wasn't going to be silent. He wasn't going to let incidents like yesterday fade away without consequence. He was going to use his new position, his voice, his platform to create real change. Not just for himself, but for Kevin, the teenager who'd sent him that text. For his daughters, for everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The work was just beginning. 6 months had passed since that difficult day on Flight 447. 6 months since Christine had publicly questioned whether David belonged in first class. 6 months since he'd shown his pilot's license and watched the color drain from her face. 6 months since he'd made the decision not to stay silent. A lot had changed in those 6 months. David now stood at the front of a conference room filled with flight attendants from across the airline. It was their quarterly diversity and inclusion training. But this wasn't the usual boring mandatory session that people sat through while checking their phones. This was different. This was real. The room was packed. Every seat was taken, and a few people stood along the back wall. David recognized some faces from various flights over the years. Others were strangers, but they were all here to listen, to learn, and hopefully to grow. In the third row sat Christine. She'd completed her suspension and bias training months ago, but she'd requested permission to attend this session anyway. David had been surprised when he saw her name on the attendance list, but he'd approved it without hesitation. "Good morning, everyone," David began. "I'm Captain David Chen, and I'm here today to talk about something that happened to me 6 months ago. Something that changed not just my perspective, but hopefully the direction of this entire airline." He had their attention. The room was completely silent. 6 months ago, I was a passenger on Flight 447, sitting in first class, trying to get home after a long week of training. I was exhausted. I just wanted to review some notes and rest. But before the plane even took off, a flight attendant approached me and demanded to see my boarding pass. She didn't believe I belonged in that seat. David paused, letting the words sink in. He could see some people shifting uncomfortably. Others nodded as if they'd witnessed similar incidents. She threatened to call security. She accused me of being entitled. She made it very clear in front of dozens of passengers that she thought I didn't belong there. And then I showed her my pilot's license and everything changed. He clicked a button on his laptop and an image appeared on the screen behind him. It showed statistics about diversity in aviation. Numbers that told a story of an industry still struggling with representation. "Here's what I want you to understand," David continued. "That flight attendant is in this room today. She's here because she made a mistake, yes. But more importantly, she's here because she chose to learn from it. She chose to examine her own biases and do the hard work of change, and that takes courage." Christine's eyes were fixed on him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering shame. But here's the bigger question I want us all to think about. What if I hadn't been a pilot? What if I'd just been a regular passenger who'd paid for that seat, or used miles to upgrade, or received it as a gift? Would I have deserved respect then? Does someone need to have impressive credentials to be treated with basic human dignity? The question hung in the air. David saw several people look down at their hands, thinking. "The answer is no," David said firmly. "Every passenger who boards our aircraft deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what they look like, where they're sitting, or what assumptions we might make about them. That's not just good customer service. That's basic humanity." For the next hour, David walked them through scenarios, shared personal stories from his 15 years in aviation, and facilitated discussions about unconscious bias. He talked about the time a passenger had asked to speak to the real pilot after hearing his voice on the intercom, the time someone assumed he was part of the cleaning crew when he was in uniform, the countless moments when he'd been made to feel like an outsider in his own profession. But he also talked about hope, about change, about the importance of speaking up when you witness discrimination, about being an ally, not just a bystander. When the session ended, several flight attendants approached him with their own stories. A woman from Colombia talked about passengers who mocked her accent. A young man shared how he'd been questioned about his sexuality by a colleague. An older attendant admitted she'd made assumptions in the past and was committed to doing better. Christine waited until everyone else had left. She approached slowly, uncertainty in her eyes. "Captain Chen," she said quietly, "thank you for what you said today, for acknowledging that I'm trying to change. How's it going?" David asked. "The counseling, the training, all of it?" "It's hard," Christine admitted. "Really hard. I've had to confront things about myself that I didn't want to see. Ways I've thought about people, assumptions I didn't even realize I was making, but I'm grateful for it. I needed that wake-up call." "And has it changed how you work?" Christine nodded. "Completely. I catch myself now when I start to make assumptions. I question my first reactions. Last week I saw another flight attendant about to do exactly what I did to you, questioning a passenger's right to be in first class. And I intervened. I pulled her aside and shared my story. She was embarrassed, but she thanked me later." David smiled slightly. "That's exactly what needs to happen. We need people who've learned to teach others. That's how real change works." "I'll never forget what you told me that day," Christine said, "when you asked if people deserve respect only if they can prove their worth. That question has stayed with me every single day since." They talked for a few more minutes, then Christine left. David gathered his materials, feeling both exhausted and energized. These sessions took a lot out of him emotionally, but they mattered. They were making a difference. His phone buzzed. A text from Kevin, the teenager who'd been on that flight 6 months ago. They'd stayed in touch, and David had become something of a mentor to him. "Captain Chen, I just finished my first solo flight today. I can't believe it. A year ago, I wasn't sure if I belonged in aviation. Now I'm actually flying. Thank you for showing me it was possible." David stared at the message, his eyes stinging with tears. This was why it all mattered. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table with Rachel, Sophie, and Lily. Dinner was over, and the girls were coloring while David told Rachel about his day. "I'm so proud of you," Rachel said, squeezing his hand. "What you're doing, it's bigger than just one incident. You're changing the culture. It's not just me," David said. "The airline created a diversity council. We're actively recruiting pilots and flight attendants from underrepresented communities. We've overhauled our training programs. It's a team effort." Sophie looked up from her coloring. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetie. You know how I told you that kid at school said girls can't be pilots? And I got really upset?" David nodded, remembering the tearful conversation they'd had last month. "Well, you told me to prove him wrong by learning everything I could about flying. So I've been reading books about airplanes, and I told my teacher I want to do my class presentation about aviation. And guess what? Now 3 other girls in my class want to be pilots too." David felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Sophie, that's amazing. You're already making a difference." "Just like you, Daddy," Sophie said with a proud smile. Lily chimed in, not wanting to be left out. "I'm going to be a pilot too. Or maybe an astronaut." "Can girls be astronauts, Daddy?" "Girls can be anything they want to be," David said firmly. "Anything at all." Later that night, after the girls were asleep, David stood in his home office looking at the wall where he'd hung his new training captain certificate. Next to it was a photo from the Diversity Council's first meeting. Pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and management, all committed to making the airline more inclusive. But his favorite item on the wall was a drawing that Sophie had made for him. It showed an airplane in the sky with the words, "My Daddy, Captain Chen," written in her careful handwriting. She'd drawn him in his pilot uniform, standing tall and proud. Rachel appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" "Yeah," David said. "Just thinking about how much has changed. 6 months ago, I was sitting on that plane wondering if speaking up would cost me my career. Now I'm teaching others, mentoring young pilots, helping shape policy. It's surreal." "You turned something painful into something purposeful," Rachel said. "That's not just admirable. That's necessary." David's phone buzzed one more time. An email from Captain James Wilson with the subject line, "New Initiative." He opened it. James was proposing a mentorship program, pairing experienced pilots with young people from underrepresented communities who were interested in aviation. He wanted David to help design and lead it. David smiled. The work continued. The changes were happening. Slowly, yes. Imperfectly, absolutely. But they were real. He thought about Christine working to unlearn biases she didn't even know she had. He thought about Kevin solo flying for the first time. He thought about his daughters, growing up believing they could be anything. He thought about all the flight attendants in that conference room today, listening and learning and committing to do better. Change didn't happen overnight. It happened in moments like these, in difficult conversations, in people choosing growth over comfort, in speaking up instead of staying silent, in using whatever platform you had, however small, to make things better for those coming after you. David walked over to his desk and began typing a response to James. Yes, he'd lead the mentorship program. Yes, he'd keep teaching. Yes, he'd keep pushing for change. Because 6 months ago, a flight attendant had questioned whether he belonged in first class. And instead of just proving her wrong, he'd decided to prove something bigger. That representation mattered. That visibility mattered. That every person who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong deserved someone who would speak up for them. He was that someone. And he wasn't going to stop. The journey was far from over. But looking at Sophie's drawing on the wall, at the messages from young pilots like Kevin, at the changes happening throughout the airline, David knew one thing for certain. They were moving in the right direction. And that was worth every uncomfortable conversation, every difficult moment, every risk he'd taken by choosing not to stay silent. His daughters would grow up in a better world because people had chosen to do the hard work of change. And he was proud to be part of that work, not just a pilot, but a voice for something bigger than himself, and that made all the difference.